Romans chapter 1 verse 1, presented by Jamie Gomez. This letter from Paul, a slave of Christ Jesus, chosen by God to be an apostle and sent out to preach the good news. Romans chapter 1 verse 1. As you read any letter or a novel, you will notice that there will be an introduction or a preface in the beginning. So this is where the author will introduce himself to his audience. He wants his readers to understand more about him and why he's writing what he's writing. So Paul introduces himself to the Romans by stating that he is a servant of Christ Jesus. He is called to be an apostle, and he is set apart for the gospel of God. So we're going to dig into who Paul is and why he stated these three things.
So Paul, the author, who is he? So Paul was also known as Saul. He was a scholar from Tarsus. He was also a Jewish rabbi from a group of Pharisees who was persecuting everyone and anyone who spoke about Jesus or believed in Jesus. It wasn't until he had a radical encounter with Jesus in Acts chapter 9 that changed his life forever. God had called him at that time. He then changed his name to Paul, where he started planting churches while spreading the gospel. In the first verse, Romans chapter 1, verse 1, he wants the Romans to know who he is under the authority of God, not the credentials that others knew him by. So Paul, a slave or a servant, he identifies himself as a servant to Jesus Christ. And this is a slave, or to be enslaved, or to be bound to a master. Being a servant or a slave at that time was the lowest of the lowest. And Paul could have introduced himself with his credentials, or that he was well known or a scholar, but instead he chose to introduce himself as a slave or a servant of God. So Paul has enslaved himself to Christ, and he does this because he wants to obey his will because of what Jesus did for us on the cross. He purchased him with his blood, not just with money, but with his blood, for dying for us and shedding that blood on the cross. So secondly, Paul identifies as being called or chosen by God, an apostle. So an apostle is one who is sent by authority with a commission, someone who is an ambassador or a messenger for Jesus, sharing and spreading the good news or the gospel. So Paul was called to be an apostle when God presented himself to him on the road to Damascus. In Acts chapter 9, verse 15, God tells Ananias, "Go, for Saul is my chosen instrument to take my message to the Gentiles and to kings, as well as the people of Israel." And lastly, Paul identifies as being set apart. So when Paul was a Pharisee, he was set apart or separated to the law of God. And as he became a Christ follower, he is then separated to the gospel of God. So Paul emphasizes in Romans, and it's mainly about God and God's righteousness and his justification. He actually uses the word God 153 times in the book of Romans. So I leave you with this. Be encouraged by what Paul says in Romans. And God has called us, and God has called you to be set apart, to be his apostle, to be his ambassador in sharing the gospel, and that we get to serve him. We get to be his slave so that we can fulfill his purpose.